Thank you very much and welcome everyone. Let me just share a quick slide to go with our introduction. Sorry, just 1 second as the interface changes for me. Sorry, just a quick okay, right. So you should be able to see my screen at this point. Right, so yeah, welcome to this session on the topic of artificial intelligence in scholarly publishing. As you know, the session will last for about an hour and 15 minutes, including 10-minute presentations from our panelists and then a Q&A. My name is Andrea. I work as a principal consultant at Research Consulting. We are a consultancy firm based in the UK and working to improve the effectiveness and impact of research and scholarly communication. I am co-chairing this session alongside Alex from SciELO, and he will be managing the questions and answers part of our session. To get us started, I'll give you a quick summary of what this session is about, and then I'll hand over to our first speaker. And just so you know, I'll be introducing all speakers at the beginning so that we can then focus on the presentations. So our session looks at the transformative impact of artificial intelligence on academic publishing, and we are going to provide a range of different stakeholder perspectives on this topic. We have 4 experts joining us, as you can see on the screen, and we will start from Katherine, who will provide an introduction on the technology and look at implications of AI for editors. Katherine is an associate professor in the Department of Decision Sciences at the University of South Africa, and she is also editor-in-chief at the South African Computer Journal and associate editor for engineering applications of artificial intelligence. She will be followed by Avi, who will look at how technology is transforming tools and services for authors. Avi is the founder and CEO of Academic Language Experts and author services companies dedicated to leveling the playing field for authors for whom English is a second language. He is also the co-founder of SciWriter.ai, which is a co-pilot that helps researchers with their writing by using responsible AI. You might have seen some of Avi's writing on AI and scholarly communication, where he's aiming to bridge the gap between publishers and authors, as well as to show how AI can support and empower non-native English speakers. Avi will be followed by Joris to discuss sector-level perspectives on the impact of AI in scholarly publishing. Joris is Program Director of STM Solutions and leads various programs and projects with a special focus on AI and research integrity. Joris worked for several leading companies and organizations across the STM publishing space, including leading a range of innovations and cross-publisher initiatives within the research and publishing ecosystem. And last but not least, we have Danny, who will look at how AI is affecting research and publishing cultures. Danny is a thought leader in the international scholarly communication space and has recently taken up the position of community manager for the Southern Hemisphere at OAPEN. She sits on multiple committees, including the Australian Academy of Science National Committee for Data in Science and the 4C11 Board of Directors. Now, I think for now you've heard enough from me. All I want to add is that, as we heard a few minutes ago, you can type your questions through the Q&A box during the presentations, and please let us know who your question is for so we can start from the right person and then open it up to all other speakers. So without further ado, I'll stop sharing my screen and hand over to Katherine for our first presentation. Over to you, Katherine.
Hi, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thanks, Katherine.
Good, great. Okay, so in this, as a panelist, I've got 3 hats on. My first hat is as editor-in-chief of South African Computer Journal. The second hat is as associate editor at the university. So I do normal teaching with students who submit assignments and so on. And I'm also a researcher in artificial intelligence, or more in the technology, or the technology such as neural networks and evolutionary computation that underlie a lot of AI technology. Right, so just to start the conversation, I want to contrast 2 commonly used tools. The one is Google, which we all use. If you had to type into Google short biography of Katherine Malan, then it would bring up some information that it finds on different websites about me and a picture of me and so on. If I type exactly the same phrase into ChatGPT, which is regarded as AI, I suppose, short biography of Katherine Malan, then it would say, sorry, but I couldn't find any information on me. And it also states that my last, ChatGPT's last knowledge update is in September 2021. So I've been around a lot longer, long before that. But the point is that ChatGPT trains on text that is available on the internet, but it uses it for training its language model. So it uses it for developing a model in order to generate text. It doesn't use the text as information in the traditional sense that Google does. Just another example, if I type into Google, give me one, or just say one paragraph describing neural networks, then it would return, in my case, it returned 443 million results in 0.33 seconds. And it decided that the information provided by IBM was the most informative in terms of neural networks. And so it put that one up at the top. And the second one was from Amazon and so on. So if I type the same phrase into ChatGPT, one paragraph describing neural networks, then ChatGPT actually gives me one paragraph, whereas Google didn't. Google just gave me a whole lot of sources with links. So the big difference is that Google has very sophisticated searching and ranking algorithms, many of them using AI technologies. It does, but it doesn't write text. It's not able to write new text. It copies portions of text that it finds elsewhere, and it gives you links to those. And then it also predicts which will provide the best answer using its ranking algorithms. So in contrast, ChatGPT actually generates new text. So it's able to write things in response to the prompt, and it trains on these textual sources, but it doesn't use the textual sources in the same way after training. So now what I want to highlight is a concern of mine as a journal editor, which is, can authors who want to send an article to my journal, can they generate the article using ChatGPT? So as an example, I want to see, can ChatGPT write a literature survey for me? And I just gave it a topic, what are the implications of AI for journal editors? And I told ChatGPT to give me references. It must have references, with each reference must have a valid DOI. And this is what ChatGPT gave me. It was this is just the beginning of it. It was 5 different points. I'm not going to go through what it actually, the content of the answer. It was a really, really good answer. But I'm going to hone in on the references, because I'm interested to see, is this a valid reference sources. So the first paper that was referenced, it did not exist. It gave a DOI, but the actual paper by those authors with that title didn't exist, although the DOI did. So but that DOI linked to a completely different paper. The second point was using a reference where the DOI didn't exist, but the paper itself did exist. So it actually managed to generate a reference to an existing paper with the wrong DOI, but it was a paper that had the right authors and the right title, and it was related to what was being mentioned under point number 2, which was peer review assistance. Okay, so this gives you an idea of what ChatGPT can currently do, and I can say that it is getting better, because it's able, some of the references are partly valid, whereas a short while ago it wasn't. That version of ChatGPT has improved. So now what do we do as a journal editor? If our authors can use ChatGPT to generate a literature review, what do we do with it? Now, the 2 tools that are, well, a tool that is commonly used by most journal editors, I use it with all of my submissions, is Authenticate. So now Authenticate picks up what portions of a manuscript are matched to portions of other, to text that's already been published. And what's nice about it is it's very precise. So it will tell me, okay, 13% of this manuscript matched a particular source, and I can go and look at that source and verify that that is the case and use that as evidence, because it's a very precise metric. In contrast, what do we do with generated text? Because generated text will not match anything on the internet because it hasn't been generated. It's new. It's just been generated by ChatGPT. So how do we pick up when something has been? So one tool is called ChatGPT 0, which can be used to pick up. It's supposed to be able to detect text generated by ChatGPT. And I gave it the answer. I gave it the text that it generated in a few slides back, and exactly it said this text is likely to be written by a human. There's a 35% probability that it was entirely written by AI. So AI detectors only give a probability of it being written by AI, and in this case, it was incorrect. So these tools are actually not reliable enough. So as a journal editor, what's the worst case scenario? What's the best case scenario going forward? I'm going to start with the worst case scenario, that the manuscripts that arrive on my desk as an editor-in-chief I have to screen them rigorously, and it's not easy to do. And I end up spending all my time filtering manuscripts to see what's real and what's not. Best case scenario is that the AI gets better and it's able to do that screening for me. Not only that, but the authors will use AI to improve their language, because AI generators write beautiful English. It will also take care of all my formatting and do the final layout and automatically, and so that I can focus on doing what I love to do and where my role should be, which is in supporting researchers to progress in their career through publishing. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. So we're now ready to hand over to Avi.
Thanks so much, Andrea. All right. So first of all, just a big thank you to Andrea for organizing the panel, and to Bernie for organizing the conference. And I want to kind of pick up where Katherine left off and talk about how AI is transforming the publisher-researcher relationship. And I want to emphasize that I take this as a given, meaning I'm not saying what will happen in the future, but actually what is already happening on the ground now. And as you all know, in your roles, there could be a lot of tension that happens between researchers and publishers, between editors and researchers. And I want to think about how we can understand the researcher's perspective in order to best accommodate them, and while not compromising the quality and integrity of the work that's actually being published. Okay, my apologies here. It seems like, here we go. Okay, so first and foremost, there is a growing interest in AI among researchers and among authors. And this is evident, I've seen this anecdotally, but this is self-evident in a number of different contexts. So one example that I recently saw was that in 2022, there were a total of 2 academic papers that were published with ChatGPT in the title. And in August 2023, there were already 957. So clearly this is a topic that is garnering a lot of interest. Number 2 is we're coming to the end of a course that I produced called AI Tool Up Tuesdays. And the goal was to expose researchers and teach them through very quick short tutorials about AI tools for research specifically. And we're going to talk about the difference between general AI tools and AI tools specifically for research. We got almost 4,000 people to register within 2 months. This is without doing any paid advertising. Over 750 people attended live, and over 2,000 people have watched the recording. So to me, this is a sign from the research community and the researcher community that these are tools that they feel can really help them fast track, make their work more efficient, make their work, when used responsibly, actually more accurate and precise. And when doing that, it can actually be super helpful. And you see here just one such post from Phil Gooch, who's the founder and CEO of Scholarcy, which is one of the many wonderful AI research tools out there. And this is just a quick chart of post-GPT, how kind of their users spiked over time. Okay, so let's start by talking for a minute or two about generic AI tools for research. When we talk about generic AI tools, I'm talking about tools that weren't built specifically for researchers, but that researchers do use in their work. So ChatGPT, we've already discussed here today. Midjourney may have come across for images. Gamma is actually exactly what you're seeing in front of you. This presentation was created by AI, not all of the images and not all of the text, but I used it in helping me, probably saved me about 50% of my time in preparing this presentation. So that's a really helpful tool. And then Jasper is more for marketing, and there's obviously many more. Now, there are some really good use cases for some of these tools. So they're easy to access. Most of them have free versions, if not cheap monthly costs for the paid version. There's a lot of trainings available for free online. Just go into YouTube, how to learn GPT. You'll get dozens, if not hundreds of videos coming up, and they're very powerful. We're all kind of here today and discussing this topic because of the power and because of the nature of these tools. However, and there is a big however, there are some big issues with using general or generic AI tools in the research context. So what are some of those issues? You probably have seen them, thought about them, come across them yourselves. One is hallucination. Hallucination is a technical term for when a generative AI, whether it be ChatGPT or Anthropic or Claude, gives you an output, so it's made up. It's not based on real fact. I think it's important to differentiate here that large language models are actually language. They actually predict words. They don't predict facts and ideas. If you look at it as a Wikipedia Lite, you're going to run yourself into problems. Number two is plagiarism. There are questions here about the sources of the text. I don't think it falls into the classic category of plagiarism, but I do think there's questions here of, well, what information was scraped in order for me to get the output that I'm getting now? And also, obviously, sourcing. Okay, now, how do we know this is already infiltrating the academic publishing infrastructure in the academic publishing world? So here is an example that we found from a article that was published in MDPI, where you see here the phrase regenerate response was actually published in the final article. Now, anyone who's played around with GPT knows that regenerate response is a phrase that's actually copied and pasted directly from ChatGPT, meaning that the author didn't think to take it out, meaning that they clearly were copying and pasting directly. The reviewers didn't notice it, the editor didn't notice it, and it ended up in a published paper. Another example, another kind of really interesting anecdote, which I wanted to share is, you go into Google Scholar and look for as an AI language model. And that's another phrase that's directly lifted from outputs that you're going to get from ChatGPT. You will find hundreds of articles that phrase already appears. Some of them are legitimate because they're explaining different concepts about ChatGPT. Some of them are just simply copied and pasted, and the authors didn't bother or overlooked actually rephrasing their work. Now, the question becomes, are AI research tools the answer? And should we turn to them to rescue us from some of the problematics that we just described with the general AI tools? And my simple answer is yes. I actually am a big believer and think there's a lot of promise in some of these tools that are coming out. So first of all, just to understand, they cover the entire workflow. So we tend to think about AI, we tend to think about generative AI and writing and creative writing, but that's only one of many use cases of AI within the workflow. So research discovery is a big part where there's a lot of startups that are in this space. Scholarly, Scite, Scholar AI, Kenia, SciSpace. These are all really interesting startups that are mostly founded, by the way, by scientists and by scientists who are entrepreneurs, who have both of those. And so these are not just kind of taking the big models and trying to superimpose them on research, but they're actually customized built, which means that they reduce the hallucinations. It means that they're looking out for problematics. It means that they source properly. So for example, I'll give you one example, Scholar AI. So that's the third logo here, the only one that doesn't have its name in it. You can actually use ChatGPT, add on the Scholar AI plugin, and you can actually get reference sources for the ChatGPT responses and outputs, which is incredible. Another good use is organization, research management, just being able to process and keep everything organized. Research writing. So that's a startup that I'm working on called SciWriter, which is hopefully going to help, especially English as an additional language researchers, to really level the playing field and make sure that their writing is not an impediment for being accepted by a particular journal or for a grant proposal. Images, creation of images, making sure that images aren't duplicated or aren't lifted from somewhere else. And review and replication. So there's all sorts of really interesting work being done around AI there. I wish I had time to jump into all of the different tools that are out there, but I highly, if you do want to learn more, you can check out the AI Tool Up Tuesdays that I'm running, where we really go into depth. Also, research dissemination is another really interesting kind of space where these tools are being put into use. So just as one example, just to understand a little bit more in detail how AI tools are being used for research discovery. So, you can extract keywords, you can get summaries of articles quite easily now through some of these tools. You can get recommendation for further research you might not have known before, or related research. So there's Research Rabbit, which makes all sorts of different connections between authors and papers. And are we headed in the direction of actually papers speaking amongst each other instead of just researchers reading papers? And image recognition and image integrity. So it's funny because AI can also be the source of our problems, but it can actually also address many of the issues in research and automate a lot of those tasks, like Katherine said before, that can be quite get us stuck in the mud. Now, I want to, now that we've discussed kind of how researchers are using these tools, well, now it's like, now the job is on us as publishers to figure out, well, what the heck do we do, right? What do we do with the fact that these researchers are using these tools, and how do we create policy or address them or tell research or educate? So first of all, I think we should start with education, meaning I think when we jump too quick to policy, we actually miss opportunities to explain to researchers what ChatGPT or other AI tools can do, what they can't do, making differentiations between science tools and non-scientific tools, explaining to researchers that they can't trust the output blindly, but it can be used in different ways in a positive way. Now, the approach that I've seen thus far, okay, is what I call the declare approach, okay? And what I mean by that is that most publishers that I've seen, and I'd be happy to see other examples in writing, basically have a spectrum. On the one hand, they say AI cannot be an author. Okay, I agree with that statement. On the other hand, they say it can be used for help with editing and for, proofreading. Okay, those are kind of the two points. Now, I agree with both of those statements independently. However, I don't think it gives researchers enough understanding of when it can and can't be used. First of all, there's all sorts of a middle ground. Well, what if it helps me to actually phrase the initial sentence, but it's my ideas, my concepts, my data, my methods? Is that okay? Unclear. Let's say using it for image, editing or revision. Is that okay? And I think so. I think it's really important for publishers kind of to make more robust policies around what we're going to allow and what we're not going to allow. And I understand you want to make decisions that are well thought out, that are considered. Now, I also think that we have to be careful not to make it a stigma, right? If a researcher is using AI tools that are allowed, such as for proofreading, are reviewers going to take that and use that against them? Are the editors going to kind of see that as a negative, as a downside? Well, if authors perceive that to be the case, well, then all of a sudden we might find ourselves in trouble. It ignores the potential for educating, not just making policy. So doing webinars, doing workshops with your authors around how it should be used and how not to be used. And finally, if and when ChatGPT or Bard or Bing, however they get integrated into search, to declare exactly where you used some of these tools may become nearly impossible for the researcher, right? It'd be almost equivalent to saying, how did you use Google in your research? Well, I don't know, a lot and in different ways, and it's not always that easy. So just to finish off here, I want to say that I think author services can serve as a bridge here. So I think publishers need to start thinking about, well, how do we improve the author experience and actually pick out those tools that we do endorse, that we do believe in, that we do think can help researchers in a responsible way, teach them about those tools, connect them with those companies to really help them advance their research. Because I think, like I said, my belief is the research designated tools are where the potential lies, and just relying on the free generic tools is where we might run into issues. I also want to point out that I don't think we should be hyper-focusing entirely on research integrity. Research integrity is a really important issue, which we're going to be discussing a lot. But there are other uses for AI within the publishing workflow and within the publishing ecosystem. So to help build brand, internal efficiencies to make your editors, give your editors tools to make them more efficient, innovating with different kinds of LLM models. And just to finish off here, you know, I recently wrote a post in Scholarly Kitchen asking, well, what would an LLM, what would a large language model, or what would a GPT based on the scientific literature look like, right? Is there an opportunity here actually for a partnership and working together hand in hand between the researcher, or excuse me, the publishers on the one hand and these large language model companies on the other, to actually have a reliable source of trusted data and information that can then be licensed to those companies to actually build LLMs that are trustworthy, that are reliable, that we can trust as a society, and in all sorts of different use cases. So I think that's something that we shouldn't be ignoring as publishers as well. Best case scenario, the way I see it, and I know I'm biased and maybe in the minority here, but I do think that embracing responsible research, AI research tools is the way to go. And doing education to authors about which tools to use, how to use them, what's the advantages and disadvantages. And as publishers, we might actually get better, more better written content faster, that's actually more equitable in a sense of enabling researchers from around the world to participate. Worst case scenario is if publishers decide that they're going to ignore the fact that the author behavior is changing, they're going to try to use some of these AI detection tools which aren't reliable to sort of police. I think that's a big mistake, and not take the changing realities into account, and start going into this mode of trying to, you know, j'accuse and making accusations and running into arguments and fights with researchers. So thank you very much for time and attention here. If anyone wants to learn any more, you're welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm quite active there, as well as checking out the websites of either of my companies. And greatly appreciate the invitation, and looking forward to taking part in the rest of this wonderful panel today.
Thanks very much, Avi. Really interesting presentation. And time to move on to Joris. Over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today about this very important topic. I'm going to talk a bit about what has been discussed earlier, and I think it ties nicely to the previous presentation. So I'm with STM Solution. STM Solutions is the operational arm of STM, and STM is the Global Association of Scientific Technical Medical Publishers. We have about over 140 members, and our mission is to advance trusted research, which is of course very relevant to the topic today. So when we talk about generative AI, this is the bit of the feeling that I had when it came. It came as a total surprise. If somebody would have asked me last year about AI and the role of science, I would have said, well, you know, science, the AI works best with data and information, not so much with language. That, of course, changed fundamentally with ChatGPT. It really took us by surprise, not just me, but I think a lot of the publishers. But interesting, also a lot of experts. I saw a presentation from a very prominent AI researcher that was, I think, 1.5 years ago, and he also didn't predict that this would happen. So for me, one of the lessons learned is, you know, we have to really follow the technology, and we have to make sure that the academic community in general, but publishers specifically, are not taken by surprise more, and that we can more anticipate those developments, because we are a bit running behind the facts. And again, we have to have a more proactive attitude towards technology, because it's driving so much today in society, but also in the academic community. Going from an axe to a sword, this is really how we feel about AI and science. It's really a double-edged sword. It has, you know, very good sides, but it also has very negative sides. So when we focus on the good sides, of course, it can really improve the quality of published material, improve the quality of the language, but also the presentation. Of course, the language barriers are very important here, ensuring that everybody has the chance to produce well-written articles, and thereby increase the chance of publication. The efficiency improvements for all stakeholders, not just for authors, but also for the publishers. It can make things, again, more efficient, more cost efficient, and better in quality as well. At the same time, we should not ignore that it has serious challenges also. Let's say more in general, it blurs the lines between machines and researchers. It becomes increasingly unclear what has been produced by a human and what has been produced by the machine. One of my focus areas as STM Solutions is research integrity, and this is, of course, a tremendous challenge. Avi has shown some of the more stupid examples. I mean, if you forget to remove those specific lines that are clearly indicating malpractice, but what it does in general, it allows people to fake research on an unprecedented scale. You can have now easily, you can produce synthetic images, synthetic text, synthetic data, which is not only very difficult to distinguish from genuine material, but let's also not forget that the current integrity checking tools are not adapted to synthetic material. If you look at plagiarism checks, it looks at existing text. When you look at the most tools that look at image manipulation or duplication, it is based upon again, the manipulation of something existing. It can't detect anything that comes out of the blue from these tools. Right after the introduction of ChatGPT, there were a lot of companies and initiatives that predicted that they would develop a tool that is able to detect it. But I think after a year, we have to conclude it's very difficult, and even the experts themselves, or even OpenAI, have decommissioned their own tool. So it's probably not going to be possible to detect anything that is generated by these tools. And last but not least, a lot of questions around intellectual property, confidentiality, and security. What happens if I upload my material in ChatGPT? Is it being used for training? So elements that are traditionally very important for our community, it is not clear how these tools deal with them, which brings another concern to these developments. But again, let's also not forget the very positive aspects of it. Now, STM has been thinking about AI for many years now. 2 years ago, we published a white paper, AI Ethics in Scholarly Communication, so best practices around the usage of AI, recognizing that AI already then was quite important for the academic community in general, but publishers specifically. We have been working with AI for many years. Of course, publishers are producers of high quality content, which is, let's say, the most important element for AI to work well. Good structured data, which we can provide. And we came up with some best practice principles around transparency, accountability, quality, integrity, privacy and security, also fairness. AI tends to strengthen existing patterns. Science is often about breaking those patterns and bringing something new. So it works in a very conservative way, which is potentially an impediment to the progress of science, as well as sustainability. But again, generative AI is a game changer. So we are working on an update of that report. More specifically, what we are developing now is the recommendations for the use of generative AI. So very practical, and Avi mentioned it, what is allowed, what is not allowed. And we are working on a set of best practice guidelines for that. It is a sneak preview I give you today. It's not finalized yet. We are probably going to produce this in the next few months before the end of the year for sure. But I just want to share with you some of the thinking that we developed. Again, every publisher often have their own guidelines. This is more like a best practice recommendation, but drawn from a lot of the guidelines that individual publishers have been developing. So let me just quickly go through them. In general, we think it is allowed and it's beneficial for authors to use generative AI as a support tool. For example, for language editing, it is optimally designed to really improve the language. At the same time, it is best to disclose that the use of those tools when it transcends that usage, so when it's more than just a language tool, so that the individual publisher can then decide whether it's allowed or not, or the editor can decide whether it's allowed or not. Also, we don't want to be very restrictive here because we don't know yet what's going to come. So it's best to follow to ensure that the authors disclose how they use it, and then the editorial decision can be made whether it's allowed or not. In any case, it cannot be used to create, alter, or manipulate original research data, such as images. That would really violate, let's say, the norms of science. It can improve, but it cannot generate or alter. We've also seen examples of AI being credited as an author, and that is not allowed. Of course, science is always a human endeavor, and one of our slogans is smart machines for creative people, but a machine should never take the place of humans in doing research. One aspect which is also very important is the reviewing process. So we have seen examples whereby review reports have been generated by means of generative AI and ChatGPT. That cannot be allowed for two reasons. Again, it's always the human that has to make the decision, not AI. Moreover, there's also the confidentiality aspect here. If you upload a submitted manuscript, it violates the confidentiality. Again, we don't know what happens with it. It is, in a way, then becoming public and people have access to it. And again, it violates that confidentiality of peer review. So it is not allowed for reviewers to upload material which is under review to these tools. Avi made a good distinction between public generative AI tools and non-public. The public ones, we really have to be careful what we are uploading there. Then there's also the reader aspect. Also here, a material cannot be uploaded in public generative AI platforms because of that confidentiality and privacy aspects. That again, we don't have the guarantees that those platforms respect these. Also, what we demand is that the publishers ensure that the use of AI by the authors, by the researchers, is disclosed, so that also the researcher can make an assessment on whether, where the material comes from, where the text comes from, and in order to judge again the contents of the material that they are reading. So these are like the principles we're developing, and hopefully we're going to publish them quite soon. At the same time, again, to end with maybe another challenge, there is the policy and then there is the enforcement. We have to conclude and accept that these tools are going to play a huge role in our daily lives, but also a huge role in the scientific activities that we have. But again, we can develop a lot of policies. How do we enforce it? I mentioned the example of detecting text generated by generative AI. It is impossible. So this is just, something we are, I think I'm going to struggle with. Enforcing is one thing, but then policy is one thing, but then how to enforce it, it's going to remain probably a challenge for the coming years. So very much a field in development, very exciting, at the same time also a bit scary, but in any case, a very exciting area to work in. If you have any questions or have any recommendations, please do contact me. Thank you.
Thank you, Joris. And now we will move on to Danny, who will look at the impact of AI on research cultures and publishing culture. So over to you, Danny. And just so you know, Alex will be picking up the conversation after this last presentation.
Thank you so much. And thank you very much for this opportunity. I'd just like to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people in Meanjin, Brisbane. And I'd like to say thank you to Andrea and Alex for getting this panel together, and for OASPA for the opportunity. So I'm going to be a bit provocative today. How surprising for those of you who know me. My provocation is that I'm stating that ChatGPT is really just holding a mirror to issues already plaguing the current scholarly communication and publishing system. About a decade ago, open access was a scapegoat for scholarly communication, and I feel that generative AI is now a scapegoat for the same system. And so this is an article that I wrote some years ago now with a colleague, Marianne Kennan, where we made the argument that open access was the whipping boy for problems in scholarly publishing. And the whipping boy is a term that refers to like a prince who was not able to be disciplined, and so there was another boy who sort of worked alongside the prince in the schooling, and if the prince did something wrong, the whipping boy was the person that got the punishment. So that's the analogy there. So one of the things that people assume when you're talking about concern about something new happening and that we need to protect what exists now, and we have spoken a little bit about that already in this panel, about what we need to do to ensure that we maintain the scholarly record, that we keep the things going as they have been going, is that what's happening currently is healthy and working well. And I would make the argument that it is not the case. So here's a few just examples of what's happening at the moment. So we've got a problem with predatory journals. We've got citation manipulation. There's quite a lot of fraud around. These are not isolated. They are all articles that are quite recent, certainly this year. And there's many, many more. So as we've already discussed a little bit, AI can make a positive contribution to authorship. And Avi mentioned this in relation to language barriers. And so here are a couple of articles, and one of which is actually by Avi, which is talking about how for those people who write in languages other than English, whose first language is a language other than English, they are disadvantaged in their participation in scholarly publishing. And so AI can offer some assistance there in allowing them to be able to write in English, or alternatively, potentially translate across lots of different languages. But then who needs AI for assisted authorship? So this is an article that came out in April, and it was about prolific non-research authors in high-impact scientific journals. And so the study looked at high-impact journals and looked at authors that were publishing very large numbers of papers. And then they found 25 of these massively prolific authors and looked at what their background was in terms of their qualifications, and also what kind of areas they were publishing in. And so 3 of the 25 had a PhD degree, but they were covering, as a journalist, multiple areas that had nothing to do with their PhD field. Some had masters, but mostly they were actually qualified as journalists. And some didn't even have a master's or a PhD in journalism either. So these were basically people who are writers for hire, and are listed as authors because they are writers, but they're not experts. They're there to help the writing process. So AI is not needed in this instance. I mean, those people may be out of a job with AI coming onto the scene, but it's not a new thing. So we've also got an example, and this is a concern that people have made, about what about people writing a whole lot of papers? And so here's an example. So this guy is a radiologist, and he's written many research papers, and many of them that have nothing to do with radiology. They're in areas like computer science and engineering, and he's used AI to generate the papers and then had them published. But you don't need AI to do that. So here's another person this year who has published a study every 2 days, and they're not using AI, they're using dodgy partnerships with people across the world, and he just gets his name on a whole range of papers, again, completely outside his own field. So this sort of behaviour is happening anyway. And here is a problem with authorship where there is no AI at all involved. And so we've got examples on the left-hand side of a multi-million-dollar trade in paper authorships. So we've got people who are selling authorships on paper. So you can pay, it's like you can pay to have a star named after you. It isn't really named after you, but you can pay to have a certificate that has your name written on it to say a star's named after you. It's very similar. You can just buy an authorship on a paper having had nothing to do with it. On the right-hand side, there are 2 studies that both looked at early career researchers and PhD students, and what they were asking was what those experiences were for those people. The European PhD student study down the bottom was mainly in Denmark. The one up the top was here in Australia, And in both cases, the issue of what we are now quaintly calling questionable research practices is very prevalent. And in most cases, that involves authorship, and that's either people being added to authorship lists or being left off authorship lists. And those authorship lists are there basically because it's relevant to people's careers about how many papers they have sitting behind them. That's what this rush is about. So I think we're asking the wrong question. This was a scholarly kitchen piece that came out earlier in the year, and it was saying GPT-3 wrote an entire paper on itself. Should publishers be concerned? And one of the statements in that paper was, is it right to use AI to write papers when publishing papers are used as a barometer of researcher competency, tenure, and promotion? I think that's the wrong question. I think the real question is it right that publishing papers is used as the primary assessment tool of researchers? I argue it's not right. And this is at a previous OASPA conference when we used to meet each other in face-to-face. There's a video here of a talk that I gave, which was called The Tail Wagging the Dole, Perversity in Academic Rewards. And we've got an academic reward system that values high publication output. So my worst and best case. The worst case is that there may be an idea amongst those that like to count papers and like to be able to push their universities up the rankings and so on, that there could be a push from the management of those organisations to say to academics, AI can free up your time, so you need to publish more. And down the bottom on the left-hand side is a very interesting presentation that was given by Jennifer Byrne, who's another Australian actually, to a recent research integrity conference. And she was talking about paper mills. And she was saying that AI could turbocharge paper mill capacity and capability. So that's the worst case scenario. There is a huge pressure to publish more because the perception is that the academics now have suddenly all of this free time. And then the paper mill industry just goes into overdrive. We've had 2 world wars and the internet has come in, and the journal system is pretty much still the same at a fundamental level. So I'm feeling that the best case scenario is that AI will actually finally be a disrupting force enough to move the scholarly publishing and assessment system into something that's fit for today's world. And that's my provocation.
Thank you very much, Danny, and to all the speakers for the brilliant presentations, very thought-provoking. We will start now the questions and answers session. Before that, I would just like to remind everyone that throughout this session, a lot of the research, a lot of resources have been shared in the chat. So make sure you catch those. So we got a lot of praise to our speakers during the presentations. But on to the first question to Avi, and it's actually, it comes from one of our speakers, Danny, who just spoke. She asks, Avi, I thought Scholar AI only looked at open access articles published by Springer Nature. I may be misremembering. If that's the case, my concern is that this type of tool might start skewing the citation practices across research. It's hardly a systematic literature research. So is it hardly systematic literature search? This for Avi.
Yes. So, okay, that's a really good question. First of all, I would say take a step back. A lot of these tools are based on the open access and are based on the ALEX database, and therefore have problematics to them in the sense that they're not capturing the full scope of research. That's definitely something that you should be aware of when using them. I do believe that initially Scholar AI specifically was Springer Nature. They then extended to all open access, and I think they are working to try and get hooked into things that are behind research that's behind paywalls as well. Obviously, that's up to publishers whether they want to allow that access, which is easier said than done. But that is one of the big limitations to some of these tools. That being said, if folks are going to be using GPT in the research context, and it's a matter of using it on its own versus using it with the Scholar AI plugin enabled, I would definitely recommend using it with the Scholar AI plugin.
Thank you, Avi. Next question is for Joris, and some of these questions are in the Q&A box, so you can follow them on the box. This one comes from Eric Hellman. He asks, when we talk about AI breaking language barriers, why can we rely on reader-side improvement of prose rather than writer-side tools, which get frozen into the source text?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think we should look at it in both ways. I mean, upstream, we can improve the language by helping the author in writing better and formulating themselves in a better way. But downstream in reading, of course, there are also tools available. I mean, auto translate, for example. I mean, some of you might be using it today. So I think it should be from both sides.
Thank you, Joris. The next question, it came during Avi's talk, but it applies to all speakers. So feel free, all of you, to jump in. It comes from Maria Machado. She asks, author services seem to be just an additional source of revenue for publishers that don't really try to educate authors. How do the speakers think this can be dealt with? Does anyone would like to go first?
I mean, I can jump in. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not sure if author services are always seen as a revenue source. I think, I mean, there are a lot of publishers that offer, services or point them to services, again, supporting the author in preparing a manuscript. So I'm not sure if I entirely agree with that statement, but in any case, I think it is beneficial for researchers in general to be aware of the various services that are available. And I think author services can play an important role in again, ensuring that there is a level playing field and supporting researchers from, for example, non-native countries to be able to publish in international journals.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to what Joris was saying by saying that I think there's actually a tremendous opportunity here for publishers to think about the entire author experience. So that starts with the onboarding and the experience that the author has in just trying to upload their article and getting communication back that it's been received. But it also extends to tools that will help them along that journey and along that path. So I agree. When publishers that, in my experience, publishers that have tried to look at this as a revenue source haven't really succeeded, because it's just trying to, I think it puts them at odds with the authors who they're trying to serve. But publishers who see this as an investment in their author satisfaction and the author experience, I think can see big benefits from it.
I tend to agree. I think that it is actually a responsibility of publishers to assist in this area. And my experience being on the other side, in the university side, having publishers coming in and working with universities to provide information for the university staff and researchers is really helpful.
Thank you. Next question. It's a combination of two questions for Avi. Sarah asks, could we have a list or link to these tools that you shared in your presentation, Avi? I'm not sure if you already shared in your chat, so if you did, just highlight that. And the next one, which is similar, is from Ashima. Can Avi share the references for AI research communication minus the human reader? Briefly, that was briefly mentioned during your portion.
Yeah, so Ashima, unfortunately, I'm not sure I fully understand that question. So if you don't mind rephrasing it, or if someone else understands it, I'd be happy to try and address it. And yes, I put in the chat here the link to the course, which is entirely free for researchers and for publishers. We're already almost finished, so all the recordings are up and you can access them at any time. And we cover about 25 different AI tools for research.
Thank you. Next question is for Joris. It came from Danny, our speaker as well. Did you have copyright permission to use that image from the film Joris? So speaks a library worker.
Yes, yes. So yeah, it's a good question. Thank you for addressing it in this presentation.
Excellent. Well, while we are with Joris, next question comes from S.M. Lucraft, who asks, who should be responsible for providing training to authors in responsible use of these tools? I've spoken to researchers this year who are dismissive of publishers inserting themselves into a process that they can use themselves independently.
Yeah, that's a very good question. That's a really good question. I think in terms of training, it is responsible of the entire research ecosystem, right? I think professors have a responsibility to engage with their students. Institutions themselves have a responsibility to engage with the researchers. So I don't think it is definitely the role of publishers to educate and train them. However, we think it is the role of the publisher to educate the potential authors that submit the manuscript about the use, and that's also why we are developing these guidelines and these best practices. For example, through the guide for authors. So what I just showed in draft, and we're going to publish. We're also going to actively encourage the publishers to communicate that clearly to the author community. At the same time, it's a very dynamic area. So I'm sure if we have the same conversation next year, there are going to be a whole different tools. So probably we're going to have to adapt these recommendations every few months. And of course, there is the challenge then that not all authors read the guide for the guide for authors, which is again another challenge we have. But definitely, the publisher should inform what is expected in terms of the use of these tools to the author community.
Thank you. So new questions just came in the Q&A box. Thank you for the audience for providing these questions. There's one from Mag Westbury, which I think could be answered by Katherine, but feel free any of you to jump in. Who asks, as the managing editor of a small diamond OA journal, I'm not sure we have the capacity to provide training in responsible use of AI tools. Is there scope for an organization like COPAC to create and maintain such guidance?
Yes, I was thinking exactly the same, because my journal isn't a big journal, and I don't know that I can invest a lot in training, but I think that what small journals can do, which is what we're striving to do, is to allow an interactive, more interaction in the submission process. So when authors submit manuscripts, we have a pre-screening phase where we can send it back and say, hang on, there's this issue. This is what we recommend. You know, if you can sort it out, then you can submit the same as part of the same submission. So I'm thinking that, you know, that we can, within that cycle, that pre-screening cycle, include resources maybe from other larger organizations and larger journals and larger publishers, with links to training materials. I don't think we can all try and do training if we small publishing concerns, but I think that we can be informed ourselves of what's available and point our readers in that direction. I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you, Katherine. Does anyone have any other thoughts to add? I see some mics open. Okay.
I mean, I'd like to just address Ashima, because Ashima clarified her question before, if that's okay.
Sure.
So Ashima, I guess, was asking about, you know, papers. I mentioned offhand that papers would speak to each other in the future, and I think that we're a ways off from that, but and I'm not hardly an expert in this field, but from what I understand, there's a movement to try and capture as much metadata from papers as possible. So really being able to understand what each piece of an article, break it down to its most basic element, and to understand what it is. And then once you do that, in theory, data can be compared to each other so long as it's on the same baseline in automated ways that we can't necessarily fathom currently. So I don't think, and I definitely don't want to be a fearmonger about, articles writing themselselves. I don't think that's relevant. I don't think it's valuable. But I do think there are automated processes. Once we do an intelligent job of tagging different data points within an article, that can give us insights using AI that we wouldn't have been able to come up with ourselves.
Thank you, Avi. Next question is for Danny. We have one from Lucy Barnes. If we accept that AI and OA are being used as whipping boys for these broader problems in scholarly communication, how can we push back against this tendency and encourage greater focus on these broader problems?
And if I knew the answer to that, we could all go home and I could retire. So that is a very challenging question to answer. But I think that one of the things that is an issue in this space is that everybody sees things from their own lens, and that's not a criticism, it's just reality. I tend to take a very broad lens, and so and that's why I sort of make these provocations, but it's quite challenging for people sometimes who are in a particular part of an ecosystem to sort of see that there may be interrelationships with other parts. And so often discussions about research integrity, for example, happen in isolation from discussions about scholarly communication or open research, and from things like research culture and research assessment. I would say that they are all the same conversation, but we're having them separately from one another. So that is really unhelpful. And the more we start to understand how interrelated these things are, it's the fundamental interconnectedness of things, the more productive conversations we might start having about how the whole thing is being held together, and how making a change in one point will affect another. The other challenge is that the people who have done well under the current system, it is not in their best interests for that system to change. And quite often the people who are successful, who are the decision makers, are those who have done well. And so it worked for me, so therefore I don't want it to change, because if I change it, then I may not be as well off as I am now. That may or may not be a conscious position, but it is pretty fundamentally sitting in there. So we just need to be aware of that. And again, that's not a criticism, it's just reality. So big challenge.
Thank you, Danny. We have just to remind everyone, we have about 10 minutes left. But we still have some questions. Next, for Avi, comes from Dominique Mitchell, who asks 2 questions. First one is, you say the AI tools can level the playing field for authors around the world, which could be great. However, don't many of these tools come with a price premium, which acts as a barrier to all being able to use the tools? And the second question is, do you think these costs will come down or disappear over time?
Yeah, so I'll answer the second question first. Most of these are some sort of freemium model, which means that there's some sort of free option and access, but yet to access certain additional features, there is a paid subscription. So it's important with each individual tool to kind of find out what you can and can't do. Some of them are actually nonprofits, such as Illicit. So those shouldn't be, bound in any way. That being said, there are costs behind developing these tools, and most of them are for-profit companies. So I would expect there to be a price tag. So I want to make 2 points. Number one is that even if there are costs associated with these things, the costs, I believe, are minuscule compared to what it would cost to do these things previously. So, just the cost of editing an article, as opposed to being a few $100s, could be now, $15. So that's just one example. So it's all relative. That doesn't mean that everyone can afford it. We need to be aware and sensitive to that. But it is a step in the right direction. Number two is that I would say this relates back to the earlier conversation we had, which is that here's an opportunity for publishers. If publishers can grant access, can pay the licensing fee and actually give access, not only are they doing a service for their researchers, but actually there's an incentive for the researcher to stick with them as a publisher for their future articles, because all of a sudden they're part of this value ecosystem, that they're getting value even before they publish their article. And that's a major incentive to actually want to stay and have a certain sense of loyalty. I think traditionally, the researchers just think about which journal. They don't even know necessarily who the publisher is behind it. So we need to think creatively about, well, how do we actually build that loyalty, that allegiance? And I don't think that, and I want to be perfectly blunt here, I don't think the publishers, or at least the big publishers, gave a damn so much about authors in previous years. All of a sudden, with the change towards more APC models and authors being more the center of their focus, well, now all of a sudden they become a really critical the really critical part of the business model. So I think this is the prime opportunity for publishers to take advantage and actually make those tools available for free, at least to the global south and to individual researchers who can't afford it. And then all of a sudden you have real opportunity, which makes both I think equitable sense and business sense at the same time.
Thank you, Avi. The next question is not addressed to any particular speaker, so I'll just ask and then feel free, any of you, to jump in. It's from Camel, who asks, in recent published articles, ChatGPT is cited as co-author. How do the speakers think about this?
I find this really interesting. I think it speaks to the problem we have of authorship on a paper being the only way you can recognize a contribution to a paper. And so we, rather than having like credits at the end of the movies, we now have papers that have thousands, and literally there are certain papers that have 5,000 authors on them, where the list of authors is longer than the actual paper itself, which is completely ludicrous. 5,000 people did not write that paper. 5,000 people contributed to the program. So we need to think about what authorship is supposed to represent, and it's supposed to represent that it is the ownership of what is printed in or published in the work. And so therefore, if there's an issue with it, that you are responsible for the content. That cannot happen with a non-sentient being, which is ChatGPT. So it does open up really interesting questions about authorship that we should be thinking about.
Yeah, as I mentioned in the presentation, we don't consider these tools to be able to serve as they cannot be credited as authors. Authorship is a human activity, and machines can't be credited for that.
I'll just add that I think it's a straw man discussion. I think it distracts from the real important issues, and the reason I think that way is because I've never met a researcher who wants to give credit for their work to somebody else, or whether it be a sentient being or not. Authors are usually fighting over prime position. So I don't think that, I think that a few people tried to publish as an exercise in stretching the lines and trying to define them, which I think was important. But I don't see this as becoming like a mass problem the same way that the kind of junk content could potentially become a mass problem.
I think maybe also it's useful to think about an older role, which is that of an editor. I mean, you can easily ask a language editor to edit your article, and many people do, and they pay for that service. And I mean, but we don't credit them with authorship for improving the language. And I think that even if ChatGPT is being used to improve your writing, it's not even generate parts of it. I don't think it makes sense to attribute ChatGPT as an author. I think it's quite silly, actually.
Thank you. Next question comes from an anonymous attendee who asks, do we need to develop different AI policies for research in different disciplines? For example, in some humanities and creative arts, where the process of writing and research are more intertwined? It's not addressed to any particular speaker.
I think the issues are quite different in different fields, depending on what kind of research you're doing. If you are doing qualitative research with questionnaires and so on, and that's how you're collecting your data, then that form of research, I think, has different issues from the kind of research that I do, which is writing, developing algorithms and running experiments. It's quite different. So maybe it is something we need to think about, I think.
I agree with Katherine 100%. I think that we need to be asking one fundamental question. Is the writing part of the essence and definition of the research itself, right? So in literature, I would argue that the medium is part of the message and the message, right? And actually impacts how we perceive the research. Whereas I would argue that in mathematics or computer science, the words are there in order to support and surround the equations or the algorithms that we're trying to present. Not saying the words aren't important, don't misunderstand me, but our level of tolerance for allowing some of these tools, I do think should be subject determinant. And I don't think that it's that difficult to actually make those distinctions, because all we need to ask ourselves is the writing part of the research? Would the research be able to be important, impactful, and understood, even if it didn't have these same words?
Thank you. Please go ahead.
I was just going to say that certainly the humanities scholars that I have spoken to have spoken about the writing process actually being the research process. It is quite different. And I don't think we've got any humanities scholars on our panel that can speak to it. So it's only secondhand information. So I think it is different.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All of you who submitted your questions. In the interest of time, we should be closing the session now. So thank you again for all our speakers for answering the questions, and for those of you who submitted your questions. Unfortunately, we did not have enough time to answer all of them, but please feel free to email and contact the speakers if you feel interested. Do you have any final remarks, Andrea, or speakers, any of you, if you want to share? Okay. So thank you again for all of you for attending this panel, and we hope you continue to watching these and participating in this conference. Enjoy the rest of your day, and see you.